For many decades, in the archives of a certain closed division of the FBI, there was a case that not even the majority of Bureau employees knew existed. Access to the materials was limited to only a few names, and any internal discussion on the subject was punished by immediate dismissal, followed by an investigation. Only recently, one of the former operatives, a man who understood that he did not have much time left to live, broke the silence. He revealed what in official documents had been mentioned only through hidden codes and indirect wording. For safety, his name had to be changed. In the file, he appeared as Michael R., an analyst of a special FBI department dealing with so-called anomalous incidents. In official classification, such cases are designated as phenomena outside conventional scientific explanation. According to Michael, everything that for decades had been shown to the public as UFO contacts was merely a facade. Convenient, controlled, created specifically to prevent questions. He claimed that the government had long known that behind many unexplained events stood not machinery and not craft, but a form of intelligence operating by principles that do not fit into any human model of perception. The story began in the year 1976, when he was sent north to a facility that officially did not exist. The base was located in the middle of a territory without roads, without infrastructure, and without markings on maps. In an underground hangar, Bureau personnel discovered an object externally resembling a disc-shaped structure. However, as Michael emphasized, this impression was superficial. The surface of the object did not behave like metal. Instruments registered anomalous absorption of light and faint peripheral oscillations similar to low-frequency electromagnetic pulses. Michael received an order to enter and conduct an initial examination. When he found himself inside, it immediately became clear. This was not a craft in the usual sense. There were no wires, no control panels, no mechanisms. Instead, the walls were perfectly smooth, slightly warm, and the equipment registered unexplained energy readings that did not match any known power source. He specifically stressed there were no miracles or visual anomalies, no fantastical effects, but the sensation of a presence, as if someone was observing, appeared without any visible cause. Later, he said it felt not like an emotion, but like a professional instinct triggered by hidden surveillance. During the examination, something occurred that Michael called an insertion. Not a voice, not a hallucination, but the sensation of structured information coming from outside. He tried to interpret it as a stress reaction, but the thoughts reacted to his internal questions before he had time to fully formulate them. When he mentally asked, "Who are you?" the answer came instantly. "We did not arrive. We are present." Michael emphasized it was not a voice, it was a concept delivered without words. The entity conveyed that what people call a UFO is merely temporary manifestations convenient for human perception. They do not move between points. They appear where necessary. From that moment, the contact intensified. He began to feel an external consciousness analyzing his memory, his reactions, his emotional responses, not to influence, to study. And then he understood the main thing. The entity was not an enemy, but it was not an ally either. Before him was an observer, a researcher, a mind studying humans as a species, not as individuals. According to Michael, the longer the contact continued, the clearer he understood. The entity did not perceive humans as equals. Its attitude resembled that of a researcher studying a biological species, without hostility, but also without compassion. At some point, the boundary between Michael's own thoughts and those insertions coming from outside began to blur. He described it as a slight pressure in his mind when inner memories surfaced on their own, not by his will, but as if someone were flipping through them, searching for what was needed. He emphasized that he felt no pain or fear. It was strictly an analytical procedure, cold and entirely rational. The most unpleasant memories, old fears and situations he had never told anyone, rose as if in a predetermined sequence. The entity asked nothing that did not need words, it simply saw. And then a thought appeared in his mind that did not belong to him. "We have been observing you for a very long time." Not as a phrase, as a fact. The entity explained that such manifestations had been recorded long before the appearance of states, writing, and structured science. People called them by different names: fiery columns, heavenly chariots, lords of the sky, signs of the gods. Every era interpreted them within its own understanding, applying layers of mythology. But according to the entity, these were merely adapted forms, convenient for human perception of that period. Then followed what Michael called the most dangerous knowledge of his life. The entity reported, humanity stopped developing long ago. According to it, people have repeated the same cycles for centuries: wars, destruction, the cult of power, fear, dependence on primitive patterns of behavior, inability to change social systems without conflict. If the dynamic does not change, human civilization will not survive the next major global cycle. The entity emphasized they cannot interfere directly. Any coarse influence would destroy the foundation of human psychology, causing mass behavioral disorders, panic reactions, and social collapse. But their goal remains the same: the unification of two forms of intelligence. When Michael heard this, his heartbeat physically slowed by his own description. He understood that this was not about contact or an exchange of knowledge, but about a gradual formation of a hybrid model of consciousness capable of combining the entity's logical structure and the emotional unpredictability of humans. The entity explained, human emotion is a unique type of energy. They cannot generate it on their own. Their logic is perfect, but they lack the ability to feel. Therefore, they required centuries of observation, data collection, and analysis of human reactions across a wide spectrum of conditions, from fear to love. For this reason, Michael said, human disappearances were real, although not massive, not regular, targeted. The entities selected those whose psyche fit their criteria best. Michael admitted bitterly, he had not been chosen by accident. The entity showed him the sequence of his own life, as if reviewing a complex report: weaknesses, traumas, emotional overloads, losses. And he understood that exactly these parameters made him an ideal subject for contact. He felt as though his entire life had been a chain of events leading him to this point, not directed, but filtered by natural characteristics. Then the contact reached its maximum level. Michael saw Earth not with his eyes, but with something similar to collective perception. People appeared as flashes of emotional impulses: fear, hope, aggression, compassion. These flashes formed a complex dynamic pattern the entity called the emotional field of the species. After this, the entity revealed its mission completely. Humanity had reached a critical threshold. Beyond this lies either transition or destruction. The goal of their species is to prepare human thinking for future processes that will begin in the coming decades, not for a contact, not for a visit, but for an internal change of the perception model. The entity listed the tasks: to lower the overall level of aggression, to reduce the influence of fear as a basic reaction, to develop the capacity for collective thinking, to prepare the human psyche for joint existence. And only after that was the main event supposed to occur: the full unification of two forms of civilization. Then the entity announced something else. We have already selected several hundred people on the planet. And these were not politicians, not military, not elites, but ordinary people with a special inner structure, the most compatible. And it added, you are one of those who will prepare the others. After that, the contact abruptly ended. The entity vanished, not dissolved, not departed, but as if it simply disabled the fact of its presence. Within a few minutes, soldiers burst into the hangar. Michael was detained without explanation and taken to an underground FBI control block, accessible only to a handful of personnel. The room where Michael was taken after the detention was located on one of the lowest levels of the complex. Even among FBI employees, very few knew that this part of the facility existed at all. The walls were ordinary, grey concrete, a couple of extra surveillance cameras, a table without anything unnecessary. But the atmosphere there was such that Michael later described it as a dense cold that does not depend on temperature. There were 4 agents. All of them were from a closed internal security division. He understood this by the nature of their questions. They were not interested in scientific details, technical measurements, or the condition of the object. They were trying to understand how far the entity had penetrated into his consciousness. Michael was forced to recount everything, literally word for word, and as he spoke, the expressions on the agents' faces became increasingly tense. These were people who had seen far too much: terrorist attacks, biological threats, illegal experiments, heavy criminal forensics, international espionage. But now they were listening as if Michael was describing something for which they did not have even a category. When he finished the story, the room fell into silence. Not the kind of silence when someone does not know what to say, but the kind when they realize everything they just heard cannot be ignored. The head of the group left without emotion, saying nothing. He returned nearly 30 minutes later, bringing an order from above. The document was brief. It contained 4 points. 1. The information is classified indefinitely. 2. Any data about the entity is considered dangerous to civilizational stability. 3. Any discussion is a federal-level crime. 4. Michael is designated as a person representing a potential informational threat. Only at that moment did he understand the real reason for their fear. They were not afraid of the entity. They were afraid of what people would learn. Why the government feared the truth. If the information got out, global chaos would begin. Imagine, billions of people suddenly find out that the human species has been observed and studied for thousands of years. The purpose of the observation is not technology but the human soul. We are not the final product of evolution, but an unfinished project. Contact is inevitable, but not through governments. The consequences would be immediate: panic, religious crises, mass hysteria, collapse of trust in authorities, a power vacuum, growth of new cults. But the most frightening thing was something else. Michael reported that the entity had penetrated his consciousness so deeply that it read thoughts, saw emotions, analyzed past events, uncovered hidden fears. And if such an entity could read him, it meant it could read any person. For intelligence agencies, this was worse than any war. Armies lose their meaning, intelligence becomes useless, lies become impossible. State secrets cease to exist. The entire system of power collapses. This is why the order Michael remembered for the rest of his life was given. Any contact, deny. Any mention, deny. Any data on the conscious nature of the object, destroy. The most dangerous question, the agents feared to say out loud. When the discussion moved to threat analysis, one of the agents, unable to contain himself, asked, "Can the entity use people as conduits?" It was an unofficial term, but the meaning was clear: recruitment, psychological influence, transmission of information through humans. They judged by themselves, by the intelligence model of espionage. But a real, physically tangible silence filled the room when the most frightening unspoken question arose. What if the entity already knows what we are talking about? It was not spoken out loud, but everyone understood. If the entity could read Michael when the contact was active, what would prevent it from continuing the observation? Why Michael was not eliminated? When the interrogation ended, he was ordered to sign documents, dozens of sheets, each of which essentially threatened him with disappearance without a trace in case of any information leak. However, despite this, he was not eliminated. Only later did Michael understand why. If the entity truly selects people according to criteria incomprehensible to humans, if it marks them, if the contact leaves a trace, then eliminating a person chosen by the entity could be perceived as a threat. And the authorities feared this more than anything. When Michael left the underground complex late at night and felt the cold air, he understood one thing. The government is not afraid of extraterrestrials. It is afraid of the truth, because the truth makes power unnecessary. He lifted his eyes to the sky and understood. His life no longer belonged to him. He was a carrier of knowledge. That could change civilization or destroy it. And now he had only one choice left to make: to remain silent for the rest of his life, or become the one who tells the world everything.